Welcome, everyone, to Make Work Happen. Here we explore how IT leaders can drive efficiency, innovation, and strategic advantage within their organizations. I'm your host, Bob, and today I'm incredibly excited to be joined by a true thought leader in cybersecurity. Jay, thanks for being here. Could you give our listeners a brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Hey, thank you for having me, Bob. Um, Hello, everybody. My name is Alex J. Balan. I'm the CISO for the Superbet Group. Superbet Group is a company spanning roughly across 10 countries, B2C, entirely B2C, with millions of people accessing our platform, with tons of technologies. It's actually Superbet Group with tons of actually companies that we acquire every now and then. And roughly, I think we're like 5,500 employees spread across the 10 countries. So pretty complex infrastructure, pretty complex, environment. Maybe some challenges here and there.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts around the topic that's near and dear to both of us, cybersecurity. So let's dive in. For many IT leaders, the landscape of cybersecurity can feel overwhelming. A constant race against new threats, often bogged down by complex, outdated practices. Jay, in this world of increasing complexity, you advocate for a fundamentally different approach. Can you start by articulating your core vision for what a truly modern security architecture should look like?
I would want to emphasize it's my vision, right? I mean, it's not entirely just mine. It's shared very much by, for example, Google's Beyond Corp. But it's not shared by, let's say, banks or more conservative companies. The way I see, and the way I've actually seen all my life, in engineering, when we say, we spend 5 hours to automate a 15-minute task, and we've done that since the beginning of time. Our aim is to be able to cut my costs, my time spent on cybersecurity, if possible, by 50%. And I think that it's more of a matter of philosophy and architecture than it is about actually securing things. For example, the first principle that's very, very, very widely discussed, but nobody actually applies it. If you kind of do a quick survey, you're going to see that nobody really applies it, is assume compromise. When you assume compromise, you're starting to look at all the assets that you have around you as compromised. Not only that, you start to look at your private network as compromised. And that kind of shifts things a little bit, because most companies would be uncomfortable with considering their private network compromised because it's a private network. But the moment you start to look at all the assets as already compromised or potentially compromised, or you start to ask yourself if a computer would be compromised by whatever, crypto locker, would it be able to spread? How much damage would it do? How would I recover from that? And many try to do this exercise, but they do it with limited scope. Maybe it's just endpoint, or maybe it's just that one Windows server in whatever cloud. I do it, and we do it across the board as a generic rule of thumb. So my red team constantly hunts potential assets that we haven't actually run simulations for. And in my world, if a computer gets compromised, I throw it out the window, get a new computer, the people resume working because it's constantly synchronized with the cloud. It doesn't mean that I don't really care about endpoint security. I have EDRs and all the technologies, but I don't really care about endpoint security because I have very good disaster recovery. And it's kind of the same thing with the private network and everything. I'm not fully there yet, but my aim is to have no network whatsoever, as in no private network, no office network. Everything connected just to the internet, all hosts isolated so they don't communicate with each other except through the internet. Access control done through identity provider, through SSO. And then if there's anything that needs to be hidden, we fix it We don't hide it. I like to practice, for example, what I like to call security through violence. There is no resilience without violence. So my red team, for example, constantly does red team engagements without notifications. In many organizations that I know of, the red team needs to announce beforehand, I'm going to attack this, I'm going to attack that. And in our case, we don't. In our case, the engineering team and the organization needs to be ready for an attack at any moment. Because, and this is very, very important to be remembered, hackers will not notify you before they attack you. Hackers not only don't take break on Christmas, they will attack when you are away from the office.
Mm.
So you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be prepared to mitigate any and all attacks at any given moment. It doesn't matter if it's Christmas, New Year's Eve, Easter, or whatever. So this is why we have ongoing bug bounty, and we have constantly red team doing surprise attacks on everybody. We have surprise phishing engagements. I think we are about 10, if not anywhere between 10 and 15 phishing across the board in the organization per year. To put things in perspective, the first phishing attack that we did like 2.5 years ago, 25% compromise rate. It was a better funnel than our marketing teams for user acquisition, Now we are anywhere between 1 and 3% with each phishing engagement.
And that's a great place to start. I want to dig in a little bit more on this internet first approach, eschewing things like private networks and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about how companies should embrace that philosophy and why it's actually simpler and more secure than trying to isolate things on a private network?
Right. Right off the bat, I can tell you that it's difficult at first because you're going to need to fix things. If you
Mhm.
think about, you got to think about, why do I have a private network? Why do I have an office network? And they're going to say, I want to minimize the chances of hackers, attacking my assets. But what really happens is that those assets actually get lost. They don't get patched in time, you know. And what actually happens is that, those assets actually become vulnerable, have a huge window of vulnerabilities. I'm not talking about hours. I'm talking about days, months. I've seen organizations that had systems that were unpatched for like over 6 months. If you move towards an internet first approach, you need to do two things. One is move away from on-premise and do it yourself.
Mhm.
Let's take Jira, just as a random example, right? You can have Jira on premise and you can say, I want to keep Jira on premise because I'm going to secure it myself and because I have confidential information. Yeah, but that's going to mean you're going to have to maintain it. You're going to have to patch it. You're going to have to upgrade it. Sometimes those upgrades are going to have problems. And when there's a new version, you're going to have a hell of a time, moving to a new version and so on and so forth. But at the same time, keeping things on the supplier's cloud, if the supplier is trustworthy, will enable you to avoid these costs, risks, and everything. You're always going to be at the latest version, and all you got to do is try to make sure that the supplier is trustworthy. And you can do that with a number of things. There's one principle that I like to call the domino principle, which is, who else is using this supplier? Who else is going to fall with me? Let's say that you're an SMB, right? And let's say you're a lawyer's office or a doctor or something that, I'm very concerned about my private information not reaching the wrong hands. And this is why I keep stuff on premise under my desk or whatever. Yeah, well, if you go to a trusted supplier, then you're going to be in the same neighborhood with Tesla, with Microsoft, with Google, with Facebook, with like huge companies, Oracle, and you look who your neighbors are, who else is using that cloud. Because if that supplier gets compromised, it's not going to be just your business that's damaged. It's going to be all these other guys as well. So you can trust that they've done their job in assessing the security of that particular supplier, and you can rest easier, keeping your data with that particular supplier. And at the same time, a difficult pill to swallow for people is that you cannot do as good of a security job securing stuff under your desk or in your data center, as well as the hundreds, if not thousands, of people working for those suppliers who do it. They will be insanely more skilled and more experienced at doing that particular job, especially for their own stuff, than you would be.
Mhm.
You want to minimize the amount of software infrastructure that you manage, patch, update, upgrade, and so on and so forth. So first principle is move everything that you can to trusted supplier, minimize your maintenance costs, and then force engineering to patch their stuff, right? Don't keep stuff under VPN or on private network just because engineering will not patch a critical or medium vulnerability. Agree on SLAs, because if they don't do it, trust me, getting through your perimeter is not the most difficult thing. There's like a ton of ingress points, especially within if you are close to the perimeter. You don't even need to be inside the building. You can do it over Wi-Fi. You can hijack some IoTs, reset them. There's like, you will never be able to properly monitor all the stuff that's in a private network to make sure that you secure it, which, while painful at first, because you will have to fix a lot of stuff before exposing them in the internet, will accelerate the reduction of your attack surface, which is insanely important. And it's going to enable not just you, the entire organization, to sleep better at night and have an easier time, managing everything, essentially reducing costs across the board throughout the organization
Mhm.
and risk.
Yep, makes sense. And I wanted to kind of circle back on something you mentioned previously about resilience through violence. Um, you mentioned what you mean by that, but can you dig in a little deeper about what IT leaders can actively test for and strengthen their defenses? Advice for some of our listeners on what they could be doing.
You cannot achieve resilience without violence. The first, if you remember back in the 1990s, you already had the I love you virus or the Chernobyl virus, but people weren't installing security solutions. They weren't installing like endpoint security on their computers because they never got it.
Mm.
So people were only installing security on their computers after they got infected. So what I'm doing, and what I suggest that everybody does, is to constantly run red teaming engagements, attacks against the infrastructure, attacks against the organization, attacks against the employees. So it enables them to kind of build this resilience, understand how the attacks work. And at the end of the day, if you do this over and over and over, they're going to build such a resilience that your attacks will be inconsequential in the grand. Our attacks became almost inconsequential after roughly 1 year. So it's going to be 1 year of slightly painful stuff at our scale, which is somewhat large. But after 1 year, everybody's going to be so much more resilient. There's going to be so few areas that are susceptible to attacks and vulnerable. And if you think about it, resilience to violence actually is a philosophy that works it matters in all walks of life. You can learn the theory about how to defend yourself. Unless you're actually hit by your trainer, so you raise your hands and you block, it's not going to be as efficient.
Mhm. Makes sense. And you emphasize that a single source of truth, particularly identity, um, is really important as the foundation for all of your security decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is and how it replaces reliance on network-centric security?
Oh man, where do I begin? So it's 2025, and there's still organizations where you can find user password authentication.
Mhm.
So and if you, the people watching, are in this particular situation and you see a prompt that says username and password, you should report it and you should do something about it, because passwords are especially if you have like non-SSO. This is what I'm trying to talk about, right? One of the first things that I've done is obviously enforce SSO across the board. it's difficult. You also have to, work in tandem with implementing things against shadow IT, because somebody just can just build a PHP service and put username and password authentication. So you got to have some stuff to catch shadow IT. What we're doing is that we're crawling the entire IP space constantly with a few tools, and some of them take screenshots and they report differences, and some of them actually monitor for shadow IT. So whenever we see something new that was not sanctioned by us or was not, taken through the proper processes, then we have a Slack bot that reports on it instantly. And usually the crawling goes so fast that we have like less than 10 minutes from the moment somebody does something stupid until we catch it. Is anywhere around 10 minutes. So you got to tie it to shadow IT mitigation. But first of all, everything has to happen through SSO, because the moment you put a username and password on a service in backend or wherever, you're going to have people sharing that account, which is the first thing. I've seen it in many organizations, right? So how do I access? Just access admin and whatever, some complicated 20-character password, but it's the same account for everybody. It gets shared. And I want to say this, a secret is something that's maintained by one person. Two or more is not a secret anymore.
Yeah, I would
So
agree with that. I actually would extend that, particularly for any kind of shared static credentials, like for, machine to machine communication. If even one human knows that, it's already compromised. Yeah.
if you have to do it, then try to onboard a password management solution with good logging, with
Yeah.
like really good logging, so you can have like tracking in your Splunk or whatever CM you have to
Yeah.
see who accessed the secret at what time and so on. If you have to do it like that, like a corporate password management or credential management solution. Now, the second thing that we need to talk about is access control,
Mhm.
because that's a tricky area as well. You need, if you want to sleep easier at night and not have to manage everything and all the apps in your backend and all the suppliers like your Slack, your Zoom, your Google, your whatever, all the Figma, all these guys that are plugged into your infrastructure, right? Sorry, Snowflake, whatever. You're going to have if you don't use IDP, your identity provider, properly, you're going to have to manage access control individually for each one of those and say, that guy has access. And if that guy leaves, you have to remember to revoke access and so on and so forth. So having a proper integration between the identity supplier and the tools that you're using, so you can define groups, and then the people are added into those groups. So you can say this group of people, let's say admins, have admin access to Snowflake. This group of people, say HR, have access to this particular part of Tableau, which is plugged into this particular part of Snowflake. So you gotta make sure that you set the proper access control, because one of the, again, very common mistakes that we see is improper access control. Somebody takes over the office manager account and then they start seeing the documents of the CEO.
Mhm.
And the office manager is not going to be the most technologically savvy person. Let's say that you try your best with MFA and everything, and then somebody that social engineers her physically into letting them have access for 5 minutes to her laptop unlocked. So stuff can happen, and
Well,
and you got to be very careful about how you set access control, who has access where. And it's very important that you do it through the identity provider and you route and don't, let me rephrase that. Forget about layer 3 firewalls. Forget about IP-based firewall or IP/port-based firewalls. You want to segregate access to applications through groups in the identity provider.
mhm. Makes sense. And then, kind of when we add all those principles together, it paints a pretty clear picture. So let's kind of put that all together and consider some abstract attack scenarios. For instance, a social engineering attempt leading to credential harvesting or session theft or an insider threat. How would you mitigate or respond to such an event using some of the principles you discussed today?
Uh, there's going to be a few more principles associated with that. For example, anomaly detection comes into play as well. So a bit of machine learning. But first of all, let's say that a user gets social engineered. Let's think about a scenario. Um, can be bribery. Let's there's departments. There's the support department. I'm going to call it outright. The support department is not the highest paid department in the organization, and they literally have access to all the customer data because they need to provide support for the customers. So they will be able to see your high profile customers, low profile customers, all of your customers. So they will be able to exfiltrate your customer database, right? And let's say somebody gives, let's say, $50,000 bribe to a support department person for like 30 minutes of TeamViewer access on their computer. And of course, they have TeamViewer installed because they're using it, or whatever similar tool, you know? And of course, they have TeamViewer or whatever similar tool installed because they're using it to help customers. So the first principle would be, I think one of the key things here is visibility on employee behavior. And so you can see that normally the employee, and you can see this with the web traffic. Usually it's like web traffic on some backend interface where they interact with the customer data and see their like details, you know. And you see that instead of spending like 10 minutes with a customer page in front of them, they're spending half an hour with 200,000 customers scrolling through them. So that's a behavior that you can catch as long as you can see it and you can aggregate that information either into a CM or into a platform that can do that for you. So you can do that with anomaly detection. Another scenario, well, let's say, let's say you have VPN. You still have VPN. Okay, fine, no problem. And you're using SSO to authenticate to VPN, which is great. I mean, not great, but at least you're using SSO, which is great. And somebody harvests, for whatever reason, the customer username and password, because phishing can do that, and they do MFA fatigue, which an attacker might be able to do. MFA fatigue sends sufficient MFA requests to the authenticator app until the user gets bored and just presses OK. So a user will get a notification on their token application saying, approve this login, approve this login, approve this login. Let's say that 80% of the users will call their security departments and say, I think somebody's trying to hack me. But unfortunately, it's always going to be that one guy or girl or whatever, one person that will be like, stop spamming me, okay. And they would allow the attacker in. And this is where IDP and the risk engines within the IDP come into play, because a good solution should be able to determine that, that's an unusual behavior, that's a very risky authentication moment, see the MFA fatigue attempts, like trying to send hundreds of MFA requests to a terminal, and they should see that as an anomalous behavior and block that authentication process.
Makes sense. And kind of to wrap up, privacy is a huge concern for everyone. I'm interested to know kind of what your suggestions are for the right mindset for IT professionals when thinking about privacy, avoiding paranoia while remaining vigilant. Can you offer some practical advice to the listeners?
I'm going to share my own view on this. First of all, you have to understand, you have to segregate your, let's say, threats. Who are you hiding the information from, right? Are you hiding it from hackers? Because some principled technologies will be enough if you just want to hide information from hackers. Are you hiding the information from authorities? Why not? Let's say that you're concerned that, you didn't do anything wrong, anything illegal. However, you don't trust that the people at the keyboard at the police, are necessarily the most ethical people. And, for all intents and purposes, we can kind of sympathize with that, And you want to make sure that they're not going to have access to your private information. So that's another category. Or you want to hide yourself from the Chinese government or the NSA. And that's another ballpark. But you got to make that distinction, because depending on that, right, you're going to have different countermeasures. If I want to hide from Bob, yeah, WhatsApp is good enough. You don't need Signal, you don't need Threema, Wire, Google Drive, perfect, good enough. You don't need to have your own server locked with encryption keys underneath your desk. Actually, I'm going to make the argument that it's riskier to manage your own security in many regards and have your own server underneath, like your own storage server in your house, than keeping it on Google Drive. Simply because you will always have blind spots. Call your hacker friend, they're going to show you a ton of the blind spots there that you thought you didn't have. Getting into your home network, easy as pie for like 99% of the cases. Getting in your home network is quite trivial. Getting your Wi-Fi password, getting in your home network. And from that point onward, somebody can just sniff the moment you connect to the storage server, and bam, they're in. Or many people actually put very crappy passwords on the stuff in their house. So if I'm just hiding from Bob or Jay, right, then traditionally just make sure that you use good suppliers like Google, WhatsApp, like highly reputable companies that would have a lot to lose if their technology would be compromised. Some obscure Chinese stuff, I wouldn't trust it. However, Samsung, for example, decent company, they do something about their vulnerabilities. Trust me, because I've reported a number of vulnerabilities to Samsung. So Amazon, good company. So look at companies that are kind of high profile and use their stuff. And that's going to keep you safe against, the bobs and actually even the police. Now, the Chinese government or the NSA, that's a different story. For that, I would definitely, just not try. You got to keep in mind, that there's so much stuff that you don't know about your system, and so much stuff that if you had to vet and validate all the stuff that interacts with your private information, you would go insane after 1 week, and you would still not be halfway through evaluating all the code and all the software from all the people, from all the companies that touch your data. And don't even get me started on encryption and certificates. We have 200 plus minus 200 root certificate authorities on our devices, issued by roughly 150 different companies across the world. What this means, for those of you who don't realize where I'm getting at, is that those 250 companies, if they wanted to, they could be able to man in the middle your communication with 80% of the internet, the 20% being certificate pinning and HSTS, which is heavily client dependent, by the way. So 150 companies can decrypt your traffic from the internet. You would not even know when it's happening, because they would sign it. They would sign their fake proxy that they use to decrypt your data with a certificate that's validated and vouched for by a root authority that's already on your device. And these companies are from all over the world: Turkey, Russia, China, all of these companies. So you got to, in some areas, you got to treat it as already compromised, but it's compromised by whom? By those cell companies, by those governments. And if you have something to hide from those governments, you definitely have to look into different methods. And if you want to hide stuff from the NSA or the Chinese government, in my world, I'm not even trying, because, and this may be like conspiracy stuff, quantum. I once did mentoring for a company that did quantum computing, and I was doing a bit of mentoring for cybersecurity. How should they structure their security architecture and so on and so forth. We got to talking, and they said that they broke RSA. They already cracked RSA. And they had not the exact number of qubits required to break pretty much any encryption that we currently use today. And I think that the quantum computer in the three quantum computers that I know of, China and US and one other, are have more qubits than the required to break crypto. So we got to look at, quantum resistant crypto now, which is in theory present, but there's no tools to test it. So it's kind of funky. So be careful. Just keep in mind who you're running from, who do you want to hide information, and of course, segregate your information. Some information is already compromised by design, your SSN. Okay, sure, you can keep it private, but don't cry, if it gets compromised. And don't lose your head if your SSN gets compromised. Your SSN was compromised already a dozen times. So there's like so much data that's compromised by design because it was shared with way too many companies. So
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wanted to thank you for sharing such a clear and actionable vision for modern security. And at the end of the day, it's really just all about simplifying complexity and empowering IT leaders. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
try to aim. I would say like try to aim for simplifying your life by fixing the foundation. It's challenging. It may look daunting, but my advice to you is to at least try, because you might be pleasantly surprised to see that your CTO will share your vision, as difficult as it may be. And as daunting as a task as it may be, start it. Start it. It may take a month, it may take a year, it may take 2 years, but if you don't start it, you will definitely not achieve it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today, Jay. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.